Connor Tomlinson is a self-described reactionary Catholic Zoomer who has amassed 94,000 YouTube subscribers to his personal show and 102,000 followers on his Twitter. He's a former host of Lotus Eaters and a contributor to Talk TV and GB News. And he joins me now in the studio. Connor, thanks for coming.
It's all right, sir. Good to see you.
Do you think we can reverse the abortion death cult?
I think the legislative overreach is increasingly kicking the ball into our court. And there was a curious admission made by devouring mother herself, Stella Creasy, when she was pushing for her amendment in very mean girlish fashion against Tonya Antoniazzi's, which won the day. I think it's because Stella's was sacrificing the art of the possible on the altar of ideology by going so far as even to abolish sex-selective abortion protections, which, of course, the demented feminist ideologues, well, they're happy for you for killing a baby literally for any other reason other than it's a girl. But during her speech in Parliament, she said, I don't want the Americanization of the abortion debate. And then proceeded to wax lyrical about how J.D. Vance is literally going to institute Gilead from The Handmaid's Tale because he was a pragmatist on the campaign trail despite being a committed Catholic and then attended March for Life as vice president. So I think that anxiety about the urgency to codify in law the unlimited woman's right to choose, being a euphemism to kill her own child at any time for any reason, including convenience, that urgency shows that they can see that momentum is against them. And it coincides, of course, with the other end of the demographic vice, which is assisted dying. And it's not just the removal of the safeguards, like the judicial sign-off on whether or not you can be euthanized, instead being outsourced to a panel of experts, which of course we all know are very trustworthy after how correct they got COVID. But also, it was Matthew Parris's piece in the Times saying we can't afford a taboo on assisted dying, saying that people will feel the pressure to have their lives taken to spare family members the additional cost of their upkeep, spare them the inconvenience of visiting in the hospital and, holding their hand as they pass away, spare the NHS and the pension system the additional costs. And that's a good thing. And so that naked, mask-off instrumentalization of a human life relative to the utilitarian calculus of how much will it cost me, how inconvenient is this unborn child or my elderly relative versus me going out to parties or making more of my career, etc. I think that sets people's deep and slumbering moral intuitions off, and so more people will begin to align themselves with, well, this is obviously wrong, so should we revisit the abortion settlement like they did in the States, where the Democrats went, shout your abortion, and despite banking it all on young women wanting to kill their unborn children after Roe v. Wade, actually fewer women than expected broke for Kamala Harris, and overall, likes of Gen Z and sensible women broke for the more pragmatic stance of President Trump and Vice President Vance.
So it's almost like these people have taken the mask off, or I've heard the idea they've bitten off more than they can chew. So obviously you've got it on that side. You've got, these women in Parliament who have done that. On the other side, you've got a huge cohort of growing Generation Z people who are turning to conservatism and Christianity. Do you think those two together will actually help create a pro-life generation?
So I'll quibble with conservatism because I understand it's the term that most people use, but you'll share this with me, especially considering your long-standing campaign to attempt to reform the Anglican Church, Ben. It's very little left to conserve.
Yeah.
It's more about the word that's been kicked around in British discourse recently has been restoration, which I think is a good way of thinking about it. It's not the, what was the Scruton quote? I know he's overquoted, but it's not the worship of ashes, but the sort of protection of a sacred hearth, and the fire is dwindling. The hearth being the original place of worship for the family around which the tribe would congregate, and then the community, the congregation, and the nation. So it all starts from the sacred fire. So I think there's very little left to conserve, and instead we're assessing as a generation whether or not the existing settlement works for us. And that settlement can be boiled down to global, secular, liberal progressivism, otherwise known as woke. And pretty much every member of our generation doesn't believe in the blank slate neoliberal settlement that came after the conclusion of the Cold War that said, we're in the end of history, we can roll out a McDonald's to every country and everyone will be fat and happy and living along consumerism and liberal democracy will be the settled idea. Instead, we fall into two camps. You're either a full-throated warrior for consolidating the gains and accelerating the revolution of the sexual revolution and various racial minority egalitarian movements like civil rights in America or the Equality Act in the UK, or you're revisiting that settlement and thinking, oh, heterosexual white men and the women who love them and Christians are public enemy number one of this ruling moral order. If every single group can play identity politics quite literally at my expense, like taking all my money and spaffing it away on telling me why my history and my heritage is evil, then maybe I don't play by those rules. Maybe instead I rediscover tradition, I break from the perverse incentives of secular liberal consumerist culture, I return to church, I have a family, I raise them with a cognizance of the fact that we were the protagonists throughout history and relative to every other time, place and culture, we were much better. And that includes cultivating strength, but also using that strength rather than in a destructive way, a way to cultivate and protect life. And I think there's a lot of evidence that young men are doing that, not just because now, according to various studies, commiserations, but Catholics among our age cohort are outnumbering Anglicans 2-1, and the Anglican Church is diminishing, but also because at the last batch of catechumens at Easter, 40% in England and or Britain and in France were young men under the age of 30. And that's encouraging. I've seen a spattering of that in my church, but I've heard, especially in the aftermath of the murder of Charlie Kirk, that the churches were heaving with young guys like us. So that's very encouraging. You've got this downward regulatory pressure that the liberal progressive settlement and the eager children of their revolution, like Stella Creasy, like Tonya Antoniazzi, like Zara Sultana and all the Greens, they're feeling that pressure. And also you've got this bottom-up sort of reawakening of the slumbering consciousness among our generation who have little to lose by throwing off the yoke of an utterly repugnant moral order which has enabled atrocities, whether that's in the vein of anti-racism with the grooming gang scandal, or whether that's the sexual revolution with limitless hookups, fewer people coupling up and getting married and having fulfilling lives than ever, or the hundreds of thousands of abortions that happen every year in our country and, of course, the millions that now happen in America.
So you talk about, obviously, the sexual revolution, and then there's this other idea about the destruction of our history and all of those things you've said. And I think what I've seen in this movement of young people is that they tend to focus on the destruction of history bit. A lot of talk about immigration. There's a demographic crisis, but all the focus seems to be on that, and they seem to be forgetting the abortion side. If you were there making the public policy, what comes first, the immigration or the abortions?
So the immigration one comes first because it's easier to fix. I mean, at the same time, I would immediately put restrictions on abortion, but the cultural issue for what drives people to see human life in such an instrumental way is harder to fix than the let's fix everything switch with immigration. Mm-hmm. Now, it isn't, people talk about the fix everything switch and, don't press the switch. You're obsessed with pressing the switch. Why do you even, the switch doesn't even exist. But it isn't actually a fix everything switch. It's a fix everything with one specific problem switch. For example, why are we paying to battery farm foreign nationals in taxpayer subsidised social housing? Like, that's all the choice. Why do we have any crime committed by a foreign national happening in our country? They didn't need to be here. Those lives didn't need to be ruined. That's also a choice. We can just make a series of different choices to decrease the number of crime, decrease the burden on the taxpayer, stop the overwhelming demographic churn that's coming from either dinghies rocking up on Dover Beach or the passport gates of Heathrow and Gatwick, where magically British values are not showered upon the new arrivals. So we can do that. At the same time, that doesn't stop our civilization culturally cannibalizing itself. Just as much as the English people, the native Welsh, Scottish, Irish, are inextricable from the British Isles, and without them the British Isles doesn't exist, those people have been formed by Christianity since, Alfred the Great, the conversion of the Saxons, since not just the codification of common law, but also the banning of cousin marriage by the first Archbishop of Canterbury. And that made our nuclearized family units. It meant that we could marry outside our immediate family, form new farmsteads across the country, meet people that were outside our family and show them moral consideration, have an individualistic ethic that was also informed by the idea that all of us are made in the image of God and every innocent human life has value. So without a revival of that, you don't actually solve the abortion issue per se, because the abortion issue is a cornerstone of the demographic crisis, as you've said. Even if you were to ban abortion outright tomorrow to protect every unborn life, that still doesn't stop people from considering life as being relative, worth to the material advantages that not creating it or caring for it have. So you will still have this cultural problem of people not valuing children when they come into their lives, or actively mitigating it against having the families that they should be having because they can't rationally or economically justify it, versus going on holidays or getting a promotion or saving for a house or all these other things. So it's a harder problem to fix, and that's why it's not that I wouldn't take legislative steps to do it, but it's not going to be solved by just flipping the legislation switches like immigration can be.
Mm-hmm. And I think it's interesting there, you've obviously mentioned this idea of the family being some sort of cornerstone in this country, and you were talking about, a generation or two above where they'll put holidays before having a big family, for example. But I think our generation is having an issue at the minute because young men and women are so different. There is this vast gap that hasn't existed before. I think the German election put it quite well, where it's, all of the 18 to 24-year-old men all voting for the AfD and all of the women in similar proportions voting for the left. That's a huge gap in the worldview of our young people. Well, and people aren't getting together. How do we fix it? How do we get them together? How do they have these big families?
So it's even worse than that, because the German election was a really curious one, because it was something like young men 18 to 24 voted 5 points more than the average for AfD. And of course, every single German party has formed a firewall to form a coalition to keep the AfD out of government, even if they get a plurality of the vote share, not an outright majority, because they have a proportional representation system. It's a whole mess. But young men were only voting 5 points more for the AfD, who are not a far-right party. They're libertarian, anti-immigration, and they're led by a secular lesbian in an interracial relationship. I mean, it's hardly the second incarnation of Adolf Hitler. Like, that's the left of me. However, young women were voting for Die Linke at 20 points more than the average. And that's the Communist Party that, if you look at the footage of their conferences, it looks a lot like Jeremy Corbyn's Your Party. It's the same sort of cast of characters from Arkham Asylum. So, not very encouraging to see the runaway radicalisation of some young women towards liberal progressivism. John Byrne Murdoch's been documenting this in his piece for the FT, where you see all the graphs of young women in the UK are far more likely to support the Greens, whereas young men have a slight tick away from being on the left. And perhaps this will come up later, we don't have a genuine right-wing party in this country insofar as, classically defined, the right represents hierarchy in church. Because pretty much all of Britain's parties are secular. If they veer anywhere even close to Christianity, well, they get hit pieces written about them in Unheard, and my name is invoked to try and sort of create a cordon sanitaire around Christianity. Don't worry, I'm not bitter about it. So it is worrying that this runaway progressivism is driving men and women apart.
Why is the difference, though? What's causing it?
I think the well has been poisoned ideologically by not just the ideology of the sexual revolution, the kind of window dressing that says that the defining feature of your life is to have hookups without any emotional attachment. I mean, see Erica Jong's novel Fear of Flying for that. Any unchosen social obligation is an unjust and oppressive incursion on your individual autonomy. That's just the foundation of liberalism, the belief that every human being is a blank slate, that we're all free and equal, and that society itself is a form of oppression. So the truly liberal government has to work to remove your dependence on other people, has to rectify material inequities. And so a child is an unjust social relationship which detracts from your personal economic prosperity. So basically, becoming pregnant is the the greatest sin against liberal morality. And this is what has been, modern culture is just downstream of that. And also the belief that, and I know these are sort of tired old tropes, but that abortion is healthcare, that sex work is real and legitimate work, that joining OnlyFans and becoming an online prostitute is just one step away from TikTok or Instagram as soon as you hit the appropriate age, and there is a definite pipeline there, both for men to get hooked on it and women to go on it. And I think that this has been presented to lots of young women as empowering against their better interests, and then they're told to distrust men who advise them against this, despite the inherent contradictions in the ideology that says patriarchy is everywhere, in all times and all places, is a legal and power structure that benefits men and has existed for thousands of years before we even had the Rosetta Stone or cross-continental communication, but somehow it's also not biological because biology doesn't exist. So all of those inherent contradictions kind of break the brain of quite a few people. And look, we're seeing an encouraging sort of breakaway in some countries. I mean, we're seeing it in France, where National Rally has a very high level of female participation. They also weirdly have a lot of gays voting for them, which I think is probably an anti-Islam thing. We're seeing a encouraging interest in, even if it is a bit pastiche and performative, online trad wife content, essentially. You're seeing the startups of things like Evie Magazine or young female influencers or authors talking to young women as women, like Louise Perry or Freya India or Mary Harrington. So you're seeing this sort of reassessment of the sexual revolution, but I don't think it's hit the mainstream yet, because I think progressive morality has kind of biohacked young women's inclination to be compassionate and agreeable. And so they have to, ironically, treat men who show up at Dover Beach, having just broken into our country, crossing many countries, as if they are infants, while at the same time regarding their infants as parasites. So it's completely inverted that morality. And I think that that mistrust of men, that mistrust of commitment, that ickiness and withdrawal from unchosen obligations and dependency on one another, combined with the suicidal empathy of wokeness as it regards to immigration and the sexual revolution, that's pried young men apart from women more than anything.
But do you think they'll grow out of that, or how would you fix it?
Oh, okay. So do I think they'll grow out of it? I think, again, the encouraging cultural currents mean that there are quite a few young women seeing the sales pitch of the left be kill your children at 9 months, flood your country with dangerous men who are often sexual predators, and allow men who have a porn addiction wearing a dress to break into your locker room and beat you at your own sports, as not a very convincing sales pitch if they don't hate the men in their lives. And there's a lot of women that don't, and they're wonderful people, etc. Do I think that a lot of women will be convinced otherwise before it becomes impossible to take back those mistakes? I think there are some women who won't, which is an absolute tragedy, and that's why it's an urgency to try and rectify this rift between men and women. Not because of, oh, they're going to vote for the wrong party, or not because, oh, the tax burden will be really high when, you know, there's a lot of single women that are looking for the pension system to make up the fact that they don't have a family to take care of them. Because every single instance of someone not having a family when they say they want it is personal tragedy. Like, the polling is quite bleak in America, where I think it was an NBC News poll a few weeks ago where it said that Republican men put having a family as their top priority, but both Republican and Democrat women put financial independence and a career as their top priority. So that means that even among conservative circles, there's still girl boss feminism kind of polluting the pool. Whereas over here, there's a lot of different studies, and the progressivism is quite bad among young women. But when you ask, for example, when you poll young women, do they want to have a family? 92% say yes. They just haven't matched that desire up with their progressive ideology, and there are too many economic barriers that discourage it, that get in the way. And then when you ask mothers, okay, would you rather stay at home, or would you rather go back to work full time, or would you rather work part time, or would you rather the state takes care of your children in state-funded daycare? There is at least a third of women who want to be full-time stay-at-home mums, a third of women who want part-time work. Only about a third want to go back full-time and offhand their kid onto a state-funded daycare apparatus. And yet the state is in direct contravention to this, because every single party, I think other than Reform at the last election, but I don't know if they've updated their family policy yet, have said, we're going to invest more in state-funded childcare, we're going to give you toothbrushing sessions, we're going to give you as little time with your children as possible so that you can go and fill out spreadsheets and grow the GDP. And I think all policy and all cultural directives need to be aimed at ensuring people properly order their desires, they match their thinking up to the instincts that they have and don't follow sterile, suicidal, progressive ideologies, and then that the state doesn't pursue policies that proactively gets in their way.
So obviously you mentioned economic incentives there. I think that's quite an interesting thing because even Reform supported it on the idea of it being good for families. Two-child benefit cap lifted. Which economic incentives would work in this? What would you put in to change that culture, and why is the child benefit cap not it?
Child benefit cap isn't it because it incentivizes indolent immigrants who have very large families to continue having more children, while the taxpayer who actually works hard and does the right thing, who want to have kids of their own but find it difficult to pay for the bills and the mortgage and those children, it makes it even harder for them to have those children while also paying for everyone else's children. So I don't think I am a perhaps slightly incoherent economist, because I'm not an economist, but I'm exceedingly libertarian when it comes to taxes, because I think that often the government takes far more than it ought to and spends it on all sorts of insidious social causes. And so I would just afuera, slash and burn the welfare system, because I think you are not only incentivizing deleterious lifestyles that are terrible for the children that are born in welfare-dependent households, like you're basically subsidizing single motherhood, drug addiction, negligent parenting, but then you're also penalizing all of the upwardly mobile, intelligent, and committed parents who, again, are doing the right thing. So you're just creating a sort of dysgenic system of perverse incentives so that people don't have the time with the children that they want, and then the people who are going to raise the children in the worst way possible are having more children and they're having them at your expense. So as far as actively incentivizing families, again, rather than taxing individuals, tax households and families, because the married woman's tax allowance has been shrunk to be infinitesimal. And now, if you are a single income earner versus a family who is earning more on a single income, then you are actually taking less home at the end of the month than this single person, even if one person's earning, like 150,000 and the other person's staying at home. Or especially if you're on welfare. I mean, you can have your after-tax spending would be equivalent to someone working on like a £7,000 a month job. If you're on universal credit, disability allowance, you've got multiple children, you've got housing benefits, you've got all sorts of subsidies, especially if you've got one of those, suave new mobility vehicles. You've got ridiculous take-home pay despite not doing the right thing. One of the most interesting experiments has been the Hungarian experiment, where they have written off women's university debt and taken away 25% of their income tax for life for every child that they've had. And then they give you a loan of, I think it's equivalent to about $30,000. And for each child you have of that, they make sure that you don't pay it back. If you get to 4 kids, you don't have to pay any of it back. They give them some housing benefits. It has only ticked up the birth rate, as far as I've seen, by about 0.2. But the encouraging sign is that despite Hungary not banning abortion, abortions have halved, divorces have halved, marriage rate has doubled. And that was during COVID when most people weren't even meeting. Mm-hmm. So hopefully long term, that means that it's going to have some encouraging demographic prospects. And as much as I've said I'm an incoherent economist, that's a large spending. But if you were to slash the immigrant welfare bill, if you were to get rid of all of the woke waste and DEI and shrink the size of the civil service and do all these other sort of restorative, healthy policies that people want to do, you would have quite a bit of money left over, even if you drastically cut taxes, which I think is sensible, and also paid off some of the debt. And so I think it would, if it were to work, if you could allot a budget to pro-family policy, I think it would be a hell of a lot better value for money than all of these other ridiculous exploits that we're piddling away taxpayers' cash on. Like, I would rather give about 500 million that we're giving to Rwandan tea farmers or something. Why aren't we spending that on families in our country instead? So
obviously you're talking about incentives for marriage. Hungary, you got married a couple of months ago. What incentivised you to do that, and how are you finding it? What have you learned?
It's been very easy, which is quite nice. It has.
You never hear that.
No. So my wife is a total anon. She's not in the space, just because politics is a brutal game full of weirdos, and there are very few people of good character such as yourself. So you never know who they're going to run into. However, the reason I did it is because I think it's very important, as we were talking about young men rediscovering tradition earlier, to make the leap of faith with those traditions, even if there are uncertainties or you haven't quite figured it out yet. Because, I mean, that's what your ancestors did. They did it in a much shorter time frame than we're typically doing. So, for reference, I met my wife in December of 2023. I might tell this story, actually. Okay. So when I was at my former employer, Lotus Eaters, the chap who runs the economic show over there, Dan, asked me, because I was the only single Zoomer in the office, to run an experiment to figure out how dating apps work. And so we had to do a broadcast on it. And so I was on there for a few months, and I did okay. And I just concluded the algorithm is basically demonic. This comes back to the why aren't men and women meeting. It's the technology, right? It's this Faustian bargain that promises you to meet this hypothetical soulmate, this perfect person for you, and then that you have infinite options of all the people prospectively in the world if you set your parameters wide enough, and that if you just fashion yourself as a kind of Amazon product, the perfect person will come along and take you off the shelf. Instead, there's an incentive to commodify yourself, and then the algorithm rations the kind of people that are eligible to you to keep you in a limbo state so that you don't give up entirely and delete the app, but you also don't get off the app too quickly so they can keep selling you advertising or a subscription so they can make money. So I said all this, and I said they're basically demonic, right? Get rid of them, have people, older people set you up. If you know two young single Zoomers, and this is still good advice, try and introduce them if you're in 30s or 40s, because it's more likely that you know what's better for them than some soulless corporation that, one of Tinder's adverts in 2018 was focused around dating as a form of self-expression. And it's like, no, actually, dating is to meet someone with whom you're mutually dependent, have a relationship, have a family, grow old and die together, so that you're not miserable and alone and solipsistic and selfish. So said all that, wrote an article, went to delete it, and then encountered my wife who was a 10-minute walk down the road. Oops. So we met 2023, I proposed after 6 months. We secured the house and then got married this year. It's been a hell of a year. And hopefully we're going to start our family, God willing, next year. Why I did that? Because I think as a generation, if we are rediscovering traditions, it's a bit like us wearing suits, right? First time we got a suit, it felt weird. Over time, it feels like a second skin. It feels improper to wear anything else. I feel weird like walking to the gym now in a pair of jogging bottoms. I'm almost ashamed. So you're wearing virtue and tradition like a suit until it fits. It's Aristotle's version of the continent man and the virtuous man. You have to be continent and practice virtue until it becomes a habit and you actually enjoy the virtue. And I have to say that despite the stress building up to my wedding, all that, I absolutely, without regret, glad I did it. And there's a lot of discourse at the moment in the third wave manosphere. So it's like post pickup artist, post discourse about family courts. Now it's about women suck. Am I right? And I find a lot of that off-putting, and I find a lot of it, and this might be radioactive to say, is men from other cultures largely talking to other men from other cultures about European women, so it doesn't really match up. However, there's this kind of hesitancy that's bled through as a general attitude, mainly because of the gender divide on politics, that says women are untrustworthy, the family court system is rigged against men, the state is involved in marriage, so it's basically a contract that you sign with no gain and you could lose everything. Why would you bother? Now, if you look at the divorce statistics broken down by not just ethnicity but religion, especially like practice, going to Sunday Mass, the divorce rates for practicing Catholics who are like heritage Americans or English people, very, very low.
I think it's something like people that pray together, the divorce rate goes down to something like 2% from 40-something. Yeah,
exactly. Whereas, and some of the other numbers are heavily subsidized from like, unfortunately, black Americans have a very high divorce rate, despite some nominally going to like a Baptist church, but it's because divorce is allowed. So if you have that value set, if you have those traditions, if you meet someone with which that tradition aligns, and then you decide to rather than indulge in the anxieties rooted in that false liberal anthropology of we're actually free and equal individuals, and we're basically test driving each other for as long as the economics allow, and we can just come apart if we're not really feeling it and find someone else that allows us to express ourselves. No, just commit to having that third thing in your relationship, so that if there's ever an argument or a trying time and that bond between you is tested, you then have commitment that's still anchoring you together. You have the vows made before God because you believe in an objective truth, a moral hierarchy. You believe that you are serving something higher than yourselves. And so you create this little platoon in which you can bring those children, act as custodians for your culture, and pass everything that you should be grateful for having inherited down the civilizational chain, so that you can, again, participate in renewing your society, not just in a political sense, but also in a personal sense. It's a really long-winded way of saying my wife's really nice and pretty.
Brilliant. Well, yeah, congratulations on your first few months. Here's to many more. Give my love to the anonymous Mrs. Tomlinson.
Yes, shall do.
That's all we've got time for. Bless you. Thank you very much.
Appreciate it, sir.